We've been going through the Sermon on the Mount. And the Sermon on the Mount, as Craig Bloomberg has said, is perhaps no other religious discourse in the history of humanity has attracted the attention that has been devoted to the Sermon on the Mount. Philosophers and activists from many non-Christian perspectives who have refused to worship Jesus, nevertheless have admired his ethic. In the 20th century, Mahatma Gandhi was the sermon's most famous non-Christian devotee. The literature on the sermon is vast. One recent study has itemized 36 different interpretations. And then, as an introduction to this sermon, which you can find again on the new church website, we have, well, we've only got this series on right now, but we'll have the entire sermon series, so if you ever want to go back and see the slides in the sermon series, that will all be on the church website. But Bloomberg made the point that even though this is one of the key teachings of Jesus, even though it's been around for 2,000 years, people have struggled to arrive at consensus about, well, how exactly ought we to interpret this sermon? What exactly is Jesus trying to say in the sermon? As the other diagram shows, the structure of the sermon is a bit of a circle. And the Lord's Prayer is the culmination of the sermon. But the beginning of the sermon and the end of the sermon really are connected. What's interesting, though, about the beginning and the end of the sermon are that people respond to them very differently. It is often the case that people will look at the Beatitudes and say, wow, they're beautiful, because they are beautiful. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are the meek. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Beautiful words. But if you stop and ask someone, how do you understand that? Well, very quickly, they begin to spread out. When you get to the conclusion of the sermon, however, people don't have that same reaction yet. As we've seen in the structure, the beginning and the conclusion really are deeply tied. Because the conclusion, well, we'll get into it in a minute. The conclusion is fairly apocalyptic. This is what one commentator notes about it. Now, there's a screen delay on this screen. Here it comes. The conclusion, it contains a concluding admonition of unity to engage in Christian practice. The admonition has the character of a basic principle. All three sections are characterized by opposites: broad and narrow way or gate, good and evil fruit, doers of God's will versus doers of lawlessness, a house on a foundation of rock or sand. All of them are about the final judgment. Here, the negative aspect, the warning against catastrophe, dominates. Again, in the Beatitudes, you get this beautiful vision of blessings for the oppressed. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are the meek. Blessed are those who mourn. Blessed are you when all kinds of people persecute you and are evil to you. That's what the Beatitudes say. At the end, warnings of last judgment. And in fact, this is very common in the Gospel of Matthew. And we'll be reading some parallel or some other examples of Matthew's judgments in the story. Very much what we see here is an apocalyptic Jesus. Now let's begin reading through the conclusion of the Sermon on the Mount when this refreshes. One of the issues that we're working on is networking in the church, so all of these things work a little bit more quickly. Enter through the narrow gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction. And many enter through it, but small is the gate and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few find it. That disturbs us. We have American sensitivities of egalitarianism and democracy. And here Jesus is saying, Many are just going through the broad gate, and it's a path that leads to destruction. Look for the narrow gate. Watch out for false prophets. They come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ferocious wolves. Did you ever wonder where wolves in sheep's clothing came from? Here it's the Sermon on the Mount. It comes from Jesus. And it's such a vivid image that you see a sheep. Now a sheep might look like a devouring wolf to a blade of grass, but to us, a sheep looks like a sheep, and you can go up to it without a lot of fear. And if you went up to a sheep expecting a docile woolly animal, and like in some Far Side cartoon, it ripped off the outer thing and was a wolf and attacked you, well, that's the image. And Jesus is saying, beware of false prophets. Well, who are prophets? Prophets are people who are truth tellers. It's not just future telling, it's people who look at the signs and say, this is what's really happening. In many ways, they're meaning makers. Beware of false prophets. They come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ferocious wolves. Other translations have them ravenous wolves. It's a ruse, it's a con man. You come to them and it looks good, and boom, they have you in a trap. By their fruit you will recognize them. Do people pick grapes from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? Of course not. Likewise, every good tree bears good fruit, but a bad tree bears bad fruit. A good tree cannot bear bad fruit, and a bad tree cannot bear good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. Thus, by their fruit, you will know them. How do you know if it's a wolf or a sheep? How do you know if the tree is any good? Time. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. Many will say to me on that day, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and in your name drive out demons, and in your name perform many miracles? Then I will tell them plainly, I never knew you. Away from me, you evildoers. In other words, people who pretended to be like Jesus and with Jesus did amazing things, and people looked and watched and were taken in. Those people come to Jesus, and Jesus says, I have no relationship with you. I won't share my home with you. Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house. Yet it did not fall, because it had its foundation on the rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on sand. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell with a great crash. Now when you listen to this, pay attention. Which house did storms come to? Both houses. Many times people think, because I'm a Christian, I won't have troubles in my life. Jesus never says that. In fact, Jesus says quite plainly, in this world, you will have trouble. Another example of the apocalyptic Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew. Once again, the kingdom of heaven is like a net that has been let down into the lake and caught all kinds of fish. When it was full, the fishermen pulled it up on the shore. Then they sat down and collected the good fish in baskets, but threw the bad away. This is how it will be at the end of the age. The angels will come and separate the wicked from the righteous, and throw them into a blazing furnace. There will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. I thought Jesus was supposed to be nice. Then Peter came to Jesus and said, Lord, how many times shall I forgive my brother or sister who sins against me? Up to 7 times? Jesus answered, I tell you, not 7 times, but 77 times. Therefore, the kingdom of heaven is like a king who wanted to settle accounts with his servant. As he began the settlement, a man who owed him 10,000 bags of gold. Did you hear that number? 10,000 bags of gold was brought to him. Since he was not able to pay, now it's quite likely this amount of gold was something that the king had given the man for some sort of business venture or some sort of enterprise. So he gave them all of this and said, take this and bring a return on this investment. He devoted this into the man's hands. And so the man owed the king this debt. Since he was not able to pay, the master ordered that he and his wife and his children and all that they had be sold to repay the debt. So what happens, right? They take your house. Now in the ancient world, they would take the family, sell the family into slavery in order to get the money back. It was normal operating procedures for kings. Every king would do it. Any king that didn't do it would be known as soft, and nobody would respect him, and nobody would repay their debts. At this, the servant fell on his knees before him. Be patient with me, he begged, and I will pay back everything. The servant's master took pity on him, canceled the debt, and let him go. But when that servant went out, he found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 silver coins. Still a significant amount of money, maybe more than a year's wages, but this guy was down the line in terms of the debt. He grabbed him and began to choke him. Pay back what you owe me, he demanded. His fellow servant fell on his knees and begged him, be patient with me and I will repay it back. Notice exactly the same thing the man had just pleaded with the king. But he refused. Instead, he went off and had the man thrown into prison until he could pay the debt. When the other servants saw what had happened, they were outraged. They were probably first outraged at the canceling of the debt, and then more outraged at this, and told their master everything that had happened. Then the master called the servant in. You wicked servant, he said, I canceled all that debt of yours because you begged me. Shouldn't you have had mercy on your fellow servant, just as I had? In anger, his master handed him over to the jailers to be tickled with feathers. No. To be fed grapes. No. To be tortured until he should pay back all he owed. It's really hard to pay a debt when you're getting tortured. This is how my heavenly Father will treat each of you unless you forgive your brother or sister from your heart. There's a strange contrast here. Last week, ask and it shall be given. Seek and you'll be found. Knock and the door will be open. This is the strangeness of Jesus, because on one hand, he can look way too lenient. In fact, it's offensive and unrealistic to us. Come on, Jesus, will you really listen to our prayers? Will you really respond to our needs? So last week, God was way too negligent, and Jesus, way too lenient, unrealistic, or optimistic. This week, it's all antithesis. It's black and white. It's heaven and hell. It's streets of gold or lakes of fire. Where did the nice Jesus go? The truth about Jesus is that he illustrates a dark truth about ourselves that we don't necessarily like being pointed out. We like to play the kingdom of nice, as long as it's convenient and easy for us and it doesn't cost us much. It was very interesting that, thinking about all of the demonstrations and riots just last week in Chicago, there was a peaceful riot that turned violent. People came with extra sets of clothing, and of course the police had a drone up there filming all of this. They changed their clothes, they put up umbrellas, they brought out frozen water bottles and incendiary devices, and they wanted to attack a statue of Christopher Columbus. And all of the big signs that they had were held together by PVC, and they sharpened the ends of the PVC and they used those as spears to stab the police. 49 cops were injured, 19 had to go to the hospital. This is the commissioner of the police in Chicago. It's a far cry from 2017 which Jenner is she? Kendall. When Kendall Jenner had that little Pepsi commercial, live for now, and here's a nice little demonstration, and all the police are calmly on the side, and she gives a nice little Pepsi. Of course, that was laughed off the air. Justification for punishment, even eternal condemnation, people who on one hand say, I don't believe that there would be a God who judges. When someone comes up that they believe have done some heinous crime which cannot be forgiven, well, they deserve punishment. They deserve torture. They deserve hell. What do pedophiles deserve? What do Hitler, Mao, and Stalin deserve? What does Christopher Columbus deserve? We like the kingdom of nice until someone offends us or even our ideas of the way the world should run. Now, the truth is, as you can tell from the difference between 2017 and 2020, life can get apocalyptic fast. Now think about Jesus' words. Enter through the narrow gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. But small is the gate and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few find it. The images that we are bombarded with continually suggest to us that life should be easy. Things should fall into our lap. Anybody who's lived long enough in this world knows it's not how life is. Don't be betrayed, don't be deceived by images that say, you can have it all. You deserve it all. It's all coming your way. Years ago, even this blog recently, the owner took it down. He was a psychiatrist in the Bay Area, and for years he's been writing a very interesting blog with a lot of very interesting ideas. The New York Times wanted to interview him, and he agreed to an interview, and then the writer in the New York Times told him that they were going to print his name, and he said, I've got patience. I don't want my name out there. I want you to protect my name. That's why his blog was always synonymous. Now, one of the things that he did a couple of years ago was a post, how bad are things? Think about it. 1%, these are of Americans, 1% of people are in prison. 2% of people are on probation. 1% of people are in nursing homes or hospices. 2% of people have dementia. 20% of people in America have chronic pain. 7% of people in America are clinically depressed. I don't know what the anxiety numbers are. 2% of people are cognitively disabled. 1% of people are schizophrenic. 20% of Americans, and this was long before COVID, are on food stamps. 1% of people are wheelchair bound. 7% of people in America are alcoholics. 0.5% of people are chronic heroin or opioid users. 5%, well, that's probably more like 20%, are unemployed. 3% of people are former workers now receiving disability payments. 1% of people experience domestic violence each year. 10% of people were sexually abused as children. This is the way this world is. Enter through the narrow gate. People are dangerous. Watch out for false prophets. We get fooled by them all the time. Misinformation, ideas that are sort of deceiving, changing the way we view the world. They're wolves. They're looking to take. They're like a pack. They're in sheep's clothing. They act like they're your friends. In time, they reveal themselves, but for many of us, it's too late. Jesus says, well, what's the safe way? Doing the will of the Father. And Jesus says there are many out there who look good, they sound good, they might even be doing miracles that you see and say, wow, surely they are from God. And Jesus says, look at their fruit. Watch what they do. Do they, in fact, mirror the Father? Now you might say, well, how will I know God? Jesus says, watch me. Jesus begins with what seems like impossible hope for the lowly and ends with difficult truths that we all experience. The real question we struggle with is, how can we know? And what Jesus says is, I've been telling you the whole time how to know. The strange thing about Jesus is he reflects some of the strangeness of God. Jonathan Edwards, one of the most important philosophers and theologians in American history, called it his diverse excellencies. Tim Keller, in his book Making Sense of God, articulated it this way. Particularly impressive to readers over the centuries has been what one writer has called an admirable conjunction of diverse excellencies in Jesus Christ. That is, in him we see qualities and virtues we would ordinarily consider incompatible in the same person, right? You have people who are hardliners. You'll never get a cent out of them. Then you have people who are soft touches. They'll give all their money away. But you don't find that in the same person. You have people who are merciful. In fact, in the United States, we have two political parties that basically represent two different archetypes. The Democrats generally are sort of the party of nice, and the Republicans are basically sort of the party of strength. Now, the difficulty is, well, sometimes you need to be strong, and sometimes you need to be kind. So, how do you manage it? And what we find in Jesus is, well, this is the way Tim Keller describes it. We would never think that a person could combine both. But because they are combined, they are strikingly beautiful. Jesus combines high majesty with greatest humility. He joins the strongest commitment to justice with astonishing mercy and grace. And he reveals a transcendent self-sufficiency and yet entire trust in and reliance upon the Heavenly Father. One of the biggest debates I always get because of my YouTube following is, blessed are the meek, and people keep wanting to reinterpret that. Surely you can't mean meek. And Jesus says, yes, meek. Who are the meek? Who are the poor in spirit? They rely on God. But the meek get trampled on. Well, is Jesus going to be trampled on? He's not always trampled on. He stills the storm. He raises the dead. Even in the Garden of Gethsemane, when the temple guard come to him, he says, I am he, and they fall back. He's got that kind of power, but then he gives himself. We are surprised to see tenderness without any weakness, boldness without harshness, humility without any uncertainty, indeed accompanied by a towering confidence. Readers can discover for themselves his unbending convictions, but complete approachability, his insistence on truth, but always bathed in love, his power without insensitivity, integrity without rigidity, passion without prejudice. This is what we see in him, and this is why when we read him, we're mysteriously attracted, but at the same time uncertain, because we wonder, can that really happen? And then when we get to the story of the house built upon the rock as opposed to the sand, we think, finally now we have the key to our own security. But then we look at the data. Jesus is crucified. Peter, James, and John, James the brother of John, first one to be killed for the faith. Stephen, Book of Acts, stoned, with Saul, who would be called Paul, standing by giving approval. Peter, crucified upside down. Paul, imprisoned for years at a time and then beheaded. Some of you might say, if this is the kind of security as Jesus is offering, I don't want it, because it seems like Jesus' house crumbles before anyone else does. And in fact, if you listen to Jesus himself, he'll say things like, they will hate you like they hated me. And Jesus says, blessed are you when they persecute you. We probably would like our heroes unpersecuted. We would like ourselves unpersecuted. But this is the strangeness of Jesus. The apocalypse always comes. We're getting a lesson in that in 2020 with the masks that we wear, the businesses we don't go to, the nursing homes that are shuttered, and those that are in them who are suffering in isolation. It might be a global pandemic. It might be a world war. It might be national. It might be the economy of a nation cratering. It might be your city. It might be that the pandemic comes to your city and really hits it hard. Somebody told me yesterday that in New York City, the number is something like 1 in 350 New Yorkers died in the early months of the pandemic. A huge number. It might be your family. It might be a genetic illness that when you get to a certain age, everyone in your family fails. It might be mental illness. It might be something that comes in acutely, or it might be something that you have to deal with for years. And it might just be only you. Because the truth is, the day of the Lord comes to all of us, and none of us get out of this world alive. And in that reality, how will you live? And that's exactly what Jesus pushes here. Jesus practiced the will of the Father. The apocalypse came for him. When he's on the cross, he cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me? Jesus was revealed to the world. The world saw him. Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they do. Surely, he says to one of the violent revolutionaries at his side, the kind of person who actively sought to pull down the Roman Empire through violence and killing, surely you will be with me today in paradise. And the Roman centurion who oversaw his execution at the foot of the cross says, surely this man was the Son of God. A Roman centurion could see God through Jesus from what he saw at the cross. And on the third day, he arose. There was the house built on the rock. that weathered the storm, of death. Well, what do we do about it? If you live like him, you will die like him, and you will be raised like him. What he offers us is a gracious invitation, because on the night he was betrayed, don't forget that word. On the night he was betrayed, he took bread and he broke it. And he said to his hapless disciples that just a few hours from then would be running and hiding in a room because they were afraid of their own lives. He said, "This is my body, broken for you. Whenever you eat this, do this in remembrance of me." This is real spiritual food. This is here to nourish you. Jesus gives his own body for us to share in his life, to live his life with him. Take, eat, remember, and believe. That same evening, he took a cup. He said, "This is a new covenant in my blood." Well, what did he mean? Well, he was speaking to a group of people that understood the old covenant. That in the old covenant, animals took the hit for us. We went and said, "It's my guilt, the animal will die. It's my debt, my servant will die." And Jesus comes and says, "I come for you. You owe the debt to me, I will cancel it, and I will pay it. Take, drink, remember and believe that the blood of our Lord was given for the complete forgiveness of all your sins." Song and then blessing and then song again.